Welcome, adventurers. Today we're going to be turning all this stuff into some floating, flying, hover platform things that look very sci-fi-y. We need some XPS foam for the base of the platform, and when I say base, I mean what we're actually building around and on this time, not what it sits on. That comes later. Now I don't have a circle jig for my Proxon, so I'm going to make one with a off-cut piece of cardboard, a medium density chipboard from my oil refinery build. Handy dandy lines to find the center from when I was considering cutting some sort of pattern out of it. Take a push pin, super glue it into the middle, and now I have something that I can push a piece of foam onto and use it as a circle jig. I find an angle that I think I like, and I roughly estimate the distance using a ruler, oddly enough, and yet still on this first attempt I don't quite get it. So I turn on the Proxon, stick it into place, and begin to mangle the edge, as you can clearly see, and where the needle is clearly not the center. So after repositioning, now I've got it into what is roughly the center without, doing anything useful like measuring or making sure, creating a guide hole, anything like that. And as you can see here, I'm not even getting all the way around a full circle to make this thing round. I'm cutting off the corners and leaving flat parts in between. Obviously, I need to do something different because though it's a neat shape, it is not the shape I was looking for. And, well, I've fundamentally destroyed this piece for my purposes with what I did. Look at that. Just horrible. So we try again using the same piece, and I get a little better, but the edges are all rough. And here you can see that dark spot where I cut in too far, leaving a big ridge. Fourth attempt. Getting a little better, figuring out some stuff. Keep it moving. Now the fifth attempt is where I really figure it out. So I push it into place at a low temp, turn it immediately off so I can affix it in place, and then turn around. Now here's all my mess ups. The ridges are too wide and whatnot to be able to get around. Well, when all said and done, I ended up with 4 hover platform bases things here. 2 large and 2 small. When I say large, you could probably put 10 to 12 decent sized 28mm minis on one of the larger ones and 4 to 6 onto the smaller ones. Here I'm drawing in a basic pattern because I want to have these seemingly glowing crevices where energy is pulsating through these devices. What I'm doing there is making a jig out of an offcut piece of medium density fiberboard, again using a different push pen. Every centimeter I poked a hole, and it allowed me to use it as a circle drawing jig, as you see there. Now the diameter of the push pin was kind of narrow, so ultimately I ended up using a toothpick as that center point so it holds it more rigidly. And I also switched to making my lines with the knife first and then enhancing them with the pen, which led me to running off, especially on this piece here. You can see the grooves look a little bit bigger in some areas. It's because that narrow push pin allowed me to waver from a true circle, and so I kind of screwed it up a little bit, but I'm going to keep going forward. I also took a little bit of sandpaper and rounded the edges a bit so that they weren't so sharp. I wanted to look like this was more molded or something, a smoother transition between the flat surfaces and the sides. Here you can see me using the guidelines for where I found my center point for cutting the circles in the first place, and just lightly scoring with a knife, following that around the edge, and then connecting it with the ruler again on the bottom side, and then utilizing my circle jig and a knife this time, make much better, crisper lines that are easier to follow with the pen. So I highly recommend, if you're going to do this, obviously use the knife first. It's easier to see the ink markings, but doing the knife blade first definitely makes it better. And as you can see here, it enhances it. And the circle jig for making my lines did an amazing job here once I used the knife first. ultimately, I think everyone but the first turned out really well. And there we go. The top left is the first one I did, and you can see the wonky one line towards the center of the screen. Just fantastic. So these are some 3D printed things I kind of mashed together in mesh mixer because they had some interesting shapes and stuff, and I literally just took a bunch of random things and put them on a disc. What I'm cutting here is called a pipette tip. We use them all the time at work, and these are used ones. And when you cut off stuff, you've got to make sure to cut your finger. This is where I realized it when there's blood on my cutting mat. So while I deal with that, I want to remind you to like, share, and subscribe. And 88% of you aren't subscribed at all. Come on. Now these are some modified thrusters from Second Dynasty's rocket ships. And if you haven't checked out Second Dynasty, you should. They have some really cool 28mm scale playable interior starship models you can 3D print if you're into it. But I kind of modified the thrusters in Mesh Mixer, shrunk them down a lot, glued them on here. These little blue pieces are extra vacuum adapters for Steri cups that I used in my last video. If you haven't checked that out, you should do so. I'll link it in the screen now. A little cross-stitch mesh to cross-stitch mesh. Man, no wonder they call it granny grating. That's hard to say. Glued on to look like vents onto the sides here. And I only did it on the smaller ones. Now, these are some used hair ties. And I've seen some other videos where people use these for cables. And they do look really good as cables, actually, for scale. I'm going to super glue these into place onto the bottoms of all of my flying platforms here. And making sure that they look right when the glue is setting there. So they look like they're obviously dangling in a seemingly natural way. The natural curve of them allowed me to do that really well. So once all that was in place, I protect the styrofoam with Mod Podge and black paint. Mod Podge and black paint. Man, I can't talk today. Add a little bit of water, so that way when I prime these with spray paint, I don't eat the foam. Obviously, you may have seen in another video where I did that. Now these hover platforms need to be a little safer than they currently are, so I took some, I believe it was 24 gauge steel wire, and straighten it out between two pliers. Using a paintbrush handle, I gave myself a gentle curve, like that. Using the Mod Podge bottle there, I actually gave it a greater beveled curve in the middle, and then the paintbrush again to give me my curve back down. Kind of roughly shaping it. Cutting off the tips to make it so it doesn't go all the way through the styrofoam. I spaced it out, pushed it into the styrofoam there, and now I'm going to glue it in place. Then I just have to repeat that process 6 more times for 3 more platform worth of things, because we don't want our minis falling off of these flying platforms when they're in the middle of battle or running from the enemy or charging towards them or whatever your minis do on flying platforms. And now they're primed. So I've got 2 that look like this, and there's the other one. Very simple. And then 2 large ones. Kind of wrap the cord or cabling around the other one so that it looks like they're kind of entangled. Now you'll see the imperfections in the decking. When I was working on the bottom and moving it around my cutting board, I saw these imperfections form, and I realized, well, that's the same side that people will be walking on and fighting on, so I left them. Free unintentional weathering. Now, let's paint them. I used Model Air, I believe, from the airbrush there. Yeah, Model Air gunmetal, and I just gave them all a complete coat over the whole surface. Nothing too complicated or difficult there. Obviously, I could have applied it with a brush, but I got a much more even coat this way. Now I'm using a black oil wash over the whole surface, and I'm doing it now, but I really could have waited until after I do my next painting step to do this. And this is a brownish, rusty colored oil wash that I put in places and then dab to make it look like smears and puddles to give a much more natural looking patina to these. Now I wanted each one to be a slightly different color, so I went with a kind of an orangish, a greenish, a yellow, and a purple. Now I want this paint to look like it's chipped away because these things obviously are flying around outside. So I take a piece of sponge and I put a little bit of this yellow in my paint tray, and using the sponge held with a pair of tweezers and a rubber band, I dab it into certain areas to create a weathered effect or pattern, showing that it's not fully covered in paint. If I got my hand out of the way, you'd actually be able to see that a little bit better. Like that. Now you don't go all the way to the edges, and that gives you, that helps sell rather that worn paint look. Of course, wherever you want it to be more intense, you put more paint on, and less intense or more weathered, you put less paint on. Remember to turn your sponge periodically when you're doing this so that you don't create an unintentional pattern on the surface of what you're painting. I've noticed that it's easy to do. I mean, if you're not paying attention, you'll have to go back and correct it when you're done. But a little bit of turn, a quarter here and there. Then I went back and re-weathered everything afterwards. Now for the glow effect. I've learned a lot. Model Air wasn't intense enough. I had to use too many layers of my regular Army Painter paint, so I went with white ink, which did real well. I also learned that I need to get better with an airbrush. Now after I put on a light coat of blue ink on top of that, I used a white oil wash, oddly enough, and put it into all the crevices to give it the glow effect. Here I'm taking a piece of Lexan. I believe this is I don't remember the dimensions of this Lexan. But you cut it, make sure you knock all the paint off of your paint racks in the process, because you have to snap it off after you score it. Find the center of your bases, drill a hole. I wouldn't drill it all the way through next time. Take a cake pop stick that's clear, cut it off to the length you want with your saw, whilst shaking your entire craft table. Use some clear epoxy. Put it on the end of your pop stick, stick it in the hole, use some tape to hold your pop stick in place. Let dry for an hour, because it's 1 hour epoxy. I mean, it's 5-minute epoxy. It's ready in 5 minutes. It takes an hour to set. Then glue your flying platforms right on the top. And you'll end up with this. Pretty cool looking hover platforms. I need a little work on my glow effect, but I think it sells here. Honestly, I never made flying platforms or any flying terrain before, so for a first effort, I think I did all right. Here's some wider shots, some figures on those, big enough and strong enough to support even other scatter terrain, like cargo crates that I made in a previous video. Just like that. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Now go have an adventure in crafting.